I think it's funny now that we're just talking about AI all the time. Nobody shuts up about AI. It's the only thing that everyone talks about right now. It's really interesting to see a film that, for me, in my view, is the most extreme example of total creativity of the artists involved. It's one of the most artistic projects I've seen in a long time, which is exactly the opposite of what AI is doing in a way. This podcast is brought to you by Backlight. Backlight Creative enhances the entire creative project lifecycle. For pre-production, there's Celtics. For scriptwriting, beatboards, shot lists, and planning. And Backlight Gem, a narrative design platform for games and VR. For post-production, we've got F-Track Studio to manage creative projects with custom pipelines and reviews with CineSync and F-Track Review for high-res, real-time media collaboration. To manage your assets, connect your own storage to Iconic, a scalable cloud-based media asset management platform. You can learn more at backlight.co. And now on to the show.
Okay, let's do this one more time. Hi everyone, I'm Ian Fales, aka Spider-Man Sydney from Earth 2027, here with Hugo Guerra, aka Spider-Man London from Earth 1067. Hi Hugo.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, he's our hero, Spider-Man, 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 Spider-Man. I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, thanks.
I did promise some dad jokes, you see, so we're really going for it. It's good.
We both went for big dad jokes. Hi everybody, we are talking about Into the Spider-Verse today, inspired by, at least when we're recording this, the recent release of Across the Spider-Verse, which I just thought was completely magical, and I thought the first film was completely magical as well. We'll get there. Hugo, we always want to start with thanking our sponsors, our Patreon supporters, and everyone who likes and subscribes us on YouTube. We really couldn't do this without them, could we?
No, we couldn't. So we can't thank them enough. Like, to our sponsors, of course, that have been supporting our channel for so long, and our podcast, and of course the Patreons, you know. And of course, we also want to thank all the regular viewers, all the subscribers, and everyone that communicates with us and send us lovely messages on YouTube as well.
Absolutely. And in case anyone's upset that they can't see Keanu behind me from my usual set, it's because I'm in a hotel room on the north coast of New South Wales with just my laptop and its small camera. So you don't get to see me in full glory, which might be a good thing because we're recording this in my morning. And you probably can tell I just woke up.
On the other side, we're recording really late here in London, so it's like 10:30 in the evening. So it's like pure, like nighttime. But yeah.
Anyway, let's jump into the episode. As I said, we're doing Into the Spider-Verse, which blew audiences away for so many reasons. I think not just because of the heart of the film is really poignant and, you know, has a great story, but the visual style of this film was so different than many American Western CG animated films were at the time. And I think it just got a new conversation going, didn't it, Hugo, about stylized animation in terms of these big budget films, where we'd got so used to Pixar and DreamWorks and, you know, that sort of CG-ness. This was something very different.
Yeah, it was like, I already told you, I know the audience is going to hate me for this, but I already told Ian that I was really late to this film. So it's really strange. Very late. I watched the film 3 times, but I've watched the film 3 times this week. So film came out in 2018. I've watched it now in 2023. I've now watched both films, both the old one and also the new one. And I know I'm to blame. I'll tell you this, like, the film is really up my alley. I love the style and I love all the trailers I've seen. I even saw some presentations of this film at the View Conference and at FMX. I even saw some keynotes about it at the time, and I saw a lot of behind the scenes at the time. And I bought the Blu-ray, the 4K Blu-ray, right as it came out, the day it came out. Even bought the book, you know, here's the book as well. and for some weird reason, never watched it. And I can't explain that. I have thousands of Blu-rays, so for some reason, it's the same thing with The Revenant. I haven't watched The Revenant either. So for some reason, I haven't watched it. I know. But I've watched it now, and I've also seen the book now, because I didn't look at the book until I watched the movie. I didn't want to spoil it for me. And I was blown away by it. Like, I just saw it this week for the first time. It was exactly what I was expecting. The film is even better than I thought it was. And in fact, I know this episode is not about the second one, but I just saw the second one today on IMAX, and it's even better than the first one. It's like, I don't even know how that's even possible. And now, of course, spoilers, just go forward a few seconds if you want, but there will be a third one, Now we know that as well. But the funny thing with this is that this film just blew me away. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. And for me, it's the same feeling I had when I saw it the first time. At least I saw it on a projector in 4K. So it was close enough to a cinema experience. Didn't saw it in 3D, unfortunately, but I wish I did. But I think to sum up the experience, for me, it was like an experience like I had when I saw The Matrix for the first time. Something like that. It was like, it really blown me away. I wasn't expecting this kind of style and class. The film is so beautiful that I think it's one of the most beautiful animations I've ever seen in my life. And I think that what they've accomplished, I think it has changed my way of looking at animation. I just feel like, I don't want to talk too long. Like, you tell me what you thought, because you saw it at the time, didn't you? So how was it at the time seeing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think of all the films that were coming out that dealt with comic books and superheroes, this was coming out at a time where we might have thought there were too many classic superhero films, and at a time when animation was looking a bit the same, just to be frank.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So the trailers for this film were sort of blew me away, but when people saw clips and trailers, they didn't. I felt like Sony didn't actually reveal too much about what was going to happen in the film, and also how different the style was. They really knew that it would surprise audiences, at watching it in the cinema for the first time. And that's exactly how I felt. At first, it's like, whoa, what is this? Is this actually 2D animated? And then, later on you find out that it's basically Sony Pictures Imageworks which had already done many CG animated films, doing it with CG animation, and then with a lot of tools and techniques and a lot of compositing, which we'll talk about later, on top of their CG animation. But in terms of my reaction at the time, Hugo, absolutely. I was like buzzing. I think I saw it twice, then did a whole bunch of interviews, and then got to see lots of presentations. But also, the story is great because it's not about Peter Parker. It's about Miles Morales. And that's something that I think a lot of audiences hadn't really absorbed, even though there's, of course, a whole comic book through line with Miles.
And there's a huge video game as well. Like, there's a huge video game for the PlayStation 5, which was like record-breaking sales at the time when it came out in 2020. So Miles Morales, on my view, on my radar, he was very on my radar because I played the game so much when it came out, and I knew the character from there. But yeah, this story is really good, isn't it? Because it's such a loving story, and it's such a heartfelt story about making friends and about being on a new place, and about it's still the Spider-Man typical story of him not fitting in, but it's even more amplified because of his background, because of the new school, because of the university, where it looks to me like this university is really high end and everyone is really good as well, and then his relationship with his father, with his uncle. The film is the story is really good. And I must say one thing, and this is not a criticism to the film. I mean, I just wanted to mention real quick that the Blu-ray, has an alternative edit, so
Oh,
I
right.
watched the film 3 times on Blu-ray. I watched the film regular without just watching it, and then I watched the commentary, the audio commentary, which includes all directors of the film, which is a really good audio commentary. It's a pretty funny commentary because you know how it is with like 4 people just chatting away. It's like a podcast almost. But then the third time I watched it, I saw this thing they call an alternative reality version, and it's like about half an hour longer, and it
Oh.
has multiple new sequences that we've never seen. Unfortunately, of course, they are just storyboarding. There's
Yeah.
no animation. It's just boards or stills or concept art. And then the voices are there because they've recorded all the voices. But they never really, only a couple of new shots, they actually went to animatic stage. They never really finished them. But the funny thing about this is that this new version actually even shows more of the backstory. It shows all of the relationship with Miles Morales' friend, like the guy that is on his dorm, on his room. There's an
Mm-hmm.
entire story with this guy where they're watching the Spider-Man movies to try to figure out how to be a Spider-Man. It's so funny. It's so funny. And it really has a lot of backstory with his uncle. It has a lot of backstory with his father. There's at least half an hour extra of the backstory. And like I said, I didn't want to criticize because I'm sure they didn't want to do a film of 4 hours long. But I wish those shots were in because if there was something that I felt when I watched the film, which I didn't felt on the second one is much deeper. I felt that it went a bit too fast and maybe the film had a bit too many fights and it didn't really had a lot of story in the first film. And I think it's because they cut all this stuff away, which I understand, the film was going to be 3 hours or something if they kept all of it. And not to mention the enormous amount of money that it would have cost to do that, those half an hour. But I recommend people go and watch it because it gives you a complete different perspective to this
Mm.
story by watching, even in storyboard level. You get a lot from it because you have the acting. The actors are so good, so you get all the performance from them on those extra scenes that are missing from the film.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been hard for the creators, directors, everyone to pull back from so many characters. And that's because this is also a film that opened up a lot more the idea of the multiverse,
Yeah.
which let the creators do so many fun, silly things and let them have all those great, they're almost cameos, but they're actually characters in the film, like Noir, Spider-Man Noir,
Yeah.
and Spider-Pig, and all this sort of thing. And so it must have been tricky to like, oh, well, he's going to be an audience favorite, but we can't really have him in so much, you know. And I think they struck the right balance. But you're right, Hugo. There's always like a
Yeah.
successful film, like you want to see more.
Yeah, and
So I bet that
it was
happened.
just. I understand why they took it out because I mean we've seen this story. We all seen the Tobey Maguire movies. We've all seen the Garfield movies. I mean, we've seen the
Mm.
Amazing Spider-Man. We all know how it works. We all know the backstory of how the spider senses work. So explaining all of this again would have been maybe like reductive because we've seen it all again. But it's just that it's really funny to see how they've made. It's really creative because they're showing a fake movie, like a movie of a Spider-Man character, as they're looking at it as a tutorial to be Spider-Man, and it's just so silly, the whole thing, and it's actually a really nice twist. But it's. I
Yeah.
think the film is it really deserved the Oscar. It's an amazing movie. It's like a really I think it's like a groundbreaking movie in animation, and we're already seeing. Don't you agree that we're already seeing the fallout of this film? Like we already see a bit of a turn on the look of movies now in 3D, of the stylization of movies in 3D in general.
A- Absolutely. Now, let's talk about that because I very purposely keep saying it was a change for American Western animation, which I'm so familiar with because simply I cover the industry. Someone will always say, but Japanese and Korean and Chinese and Taiwanese
And French
animation
animation
films
and this, yeah, exactly.
and French animation were always doing 2D stylization and sometimes regularly these days animated in 3D. So clearly Spider-Verse is not the first to do that at
Yeah,
all. But there was something happening with what you could say is either photoreal CG from the classic Walt Disney animation films, not classic, the modern 3D animation, Walt Disney animation films, DreamWorks, Pixar, Illumination, even ImageWorks, which was doing it more work for hire, and some Sony animation films, had got to a point where their cartoony characters or their fully CG worlds, they didn't necessarily look all the same, but they were going for a very animation photoreal look, which they could do in RenderMan, Arnold, all the different renderers that are out there. And I actually feel like audiences, well, me personally, perhaps, is the best example, we were getting a bit bored with that look and feel, even despite how great it was.
Yeah.
And so as soon as Spider-Verse came out and had what we now call non-photorealistic rendering or stylized animation, although I think it had it to the level of 11, we then started seeing DreamWorks and Pixar and other companies do more NPR stuff. Now, sometimes that was just for background. Sometimes it was about changing frame rates, which is a big thing that Spider-Verse does. I don't think the other studios have gone as crazy as Spider-Verse. But it's a nice change, right? Like, it's a really nice change to see different kinds of animation around now.
It is. And the funny thing about this is that obviously it's highly inspired by the comic book itself, which is, in a way, something very American. So I understand your reluctant, like your discussion about, yes, we have manga, yes, we have French animation, yes, we have all the other things, but essentially the comic book is kind of an American thing. It's always been an American thing. I know we've always had comic strips and comic books before, but the Spider-Man, the Batman, the Superman, all these comic books are very American, and the way they look, with the boards and the way that you see the dots and the way that you see the misprints and the alpha tone, the color aberration, all these kind of like little things that we see on these comic books, I've never really been transferred completely to the screen. We've never seen them, at least like this. And I think it's a really inspired moment for them to do something so risky, because it's like you said, everyone was just watching CG, everything is CG, and to a point that we had a phase where people left 2D to go to CG, and now we're kind of going a little back again, but not quite. We're going back in a special way. We're using the CG in combination with these things that they can find from the artwork of these comic books. And in a way, I guess the funny thing about this is that we always look at these books, the art books. You have a bunch, I have a bunch, and we always look at these books and we think, oh my God, this looks so beautiful, but it's always so much better on the book than on the film.
Yeah.
And I think for the first time, I look at the film and I see the frames of this book, and I kind of like, they've managed to nail every single sequence, every single shot looks like a painting from this book. And that's a major achievement, that mixing and merging of styles that they've managed to do,
Yeah. Just leaning into the comic book style or leaning into the hand-drawn style.
Yeah.
As well as, and you already mentioned these, Hugo, leaning into the inconsistencies that come from the printing process of comic books, which then in a meta way, comic books also lean into, right? Yeah. So in the film, those inconsistencies are like not accidents. It's all deliberate, where lines might not follow, outlines and ink lines might not correctly follow cars or characters, or the colors are inconsistent.
Yeah.
What I think my biggest takeaway was with this film, and then even more in the second film, which we absolutely will have an episode on.
Oh yeah, we are doing that for sure. Yeah,
is that like almost no two shots are the same.
Yeah,
and that is revolutionary for an American animated film, and almost the riskiest part of this filmmaking.
Yeah,
because it's like, are we going to take the audience out of the film by doing it like that? And also, frankly, it takes away the pipeline side of CG animation production, which for so many years was all about, well, let's build the world, let's model and rig the characters, and then we can basically use them in very standard ways in the scenes. Well, let's throw this all out for Spider-Verse, you know. And those inconsistencies are what the audience is reacting to, I think.
Absolutely. And it's also fascinating. You know, I think this is one of the most artistic films I've ever seen in a long, 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 long time. And the reason I'm saying that is because they managed to do, like, the creators on this film, which there are many. I'm not even going to name everyone because there's so many people involved in this film. You know, the props to all of them because they're all amazing. But anyway, going back to that, they managed to do something that I thought it was impossible. You know, we always cringe at the fact that you see 3D with 2D. It's always like, doesn't really work very well. It's like the example I have up right now. Like when you have manga mixed with 30s cartoons and mixed with 60s cartoons and then mixed with the CG background. It's like all of these things shouldn't work. None of this should work. And somehow they managed to get it to work. And the reason they managed to get it to work is because they've basically animated them all in very different tones. Like the manga side is completely like any other manga film, but it's completely merged and animated more fluidly than for example, Miles Morales, which is animated in twos instead of one. So it's a bit like they've managed to synchronize all these looks and get them to all look the same because they've still kept the 3D light interaction. So you still have the rim lights, you still have the light sources. So in a way, all these characters look like 2D, but they're not 2D. They're 3D shaded to look like 2D. Like they're 3D shaded to look like 2D. And because they're 3D, the advantage is that you can have light sources, you can have bounce light, you can have rim light. And that is the trick. That's why they fit along. That's why they connect. Yeah. Exactly. Because you see the bounce, you know.
You're absolutely right. They do feel integrated into every shot. They're not just stuck on, and they're not just there for like effect. Like, oh, well, let's have a cross hatching here because it's cool. They absolutely do. And you're right, there is that amazing 3D to 2D translation, which definitely comes from whatever 3D tools were built for the film. But as we'll talk about, Hugo, there's a huge compositing side to it as well. And the experience of ImageWorks in compositing and just knowing what live action should look like, as well as their 3D animation things, came in a huge way here, I think.
Yeah.
But we will get to that. Hugo, one thing I want to talk about really quickly is something about the film's beginnings. Now, of course, there's a Lord and Miller side to this, and Sony wanted to keep the Spider-Man franchise going in different ways, and they basically wrote the script and came up with the idea, and just brilliant. But they also, after bringing on an initial director, also had an art director and now semi-famous director called Alberto Mielgo. I'm really going to screw up his name. But he defined very early on the kind of style of the film with a few kind of key images. He didn't stay on the film. He's sort of moved on to other things. Maybe he just he's a bit of a ruck baker. I think he does what he wants. Later, people saw his amazing stuff in a film called The Witness in Love, Death and the Robots, and part of that was really great style, but also some beautiful, natural animation that seemed to come directly from reference shots done. But I just wanted to shout out to him because there were a few key concept images that were done early on that I think set the tone for what Spider-Verse looked like. Absolutely, Sony moved it on and made it even better than what Alberto was going to bring to the table. I just thought that was an interesting thing that where we later saw what Alberto was capable of. He's done other films for Love, Death and Robots, and he's done a few other things, since then as well, that, people are like, whoa, who is this guy? But he was part of the Spider-Verse universe for a short time.
Yeah, of course. It's funny, isn't it? Because there's so many people involved in this project. They even speak about that on the audio commentary, that they can't even like. It's funny how the directors. There's three of them, of course, which is very unusual, but there's three of them, and even them on the audio commentary, they keep saying we are here talking in part because of all the hundreds of people that worked on this film. So we actually, not just us, it's everyone, because everyone was so involved on this production. Everyone kind of chip in, as they say, to do this project. And so it's really humbling to see. It's really nice to see them being so humble about their position on the film, and that everyone contributed, and they keep like name dropping everyone on the commentary. It's really nice to see. I love that, and I really enjoy that, seeing directors really. And I guess it makes sense because they come from the animation world, and they come from storyboarding, and they come from 2D, and so they've been on the trenches as well. So I'm sure they are very familiar to the amount of work that is on display here, and I think that's nice of them to name drop. But there is a funny side of this, which has to do with the process of how this was done, and since you've mentioned that beginning of the project, this kind of project, which is so creative, cannot be done very quickly. This is the kind of thing, and of course, I've done projects that are much, much simpler, and even those take enormous amounts of time to develop a certain look. And so they mention on the commentary that sometimes they had 50, 60, 70 versions of shots. And anyone listening might think, oh my God, that's so bad. Oh my God, it's so horrible. How can they do so many versions? But I just wanted to like mention to everyone involved that usually to come up with something like this, because this is very special, this is very different from everything else, although it's taking inspiration from so many sources that already existed there, I think you cannot reach a level of quality and a level of look without doing so many versions. There's just no other way. And so when I hear them saying that this sequence, we made 70 versions, and we were only happy on version 66, I completely get it, and I can't even imagine how much work it takes to develop this language, because it is a language. They developed an entire language, which now they've kind of like amplified it on the second film, because you look at the second film and it's like even better, in which I didn't really thought it was possible, but they did. They've upped the ante for sure. And in some way, they actually went on a different direction, kind of with the look, which is really interesting to see. But I just wanted to like talk about that, and I guess I have one note here that I just wanted to make sure I wanted to like talk about, because this is, I think it's funny now that we're just talking about AI all the time. That's the buzz of it's the word of the month. Nobody shuts up about AI. It's the only thing that everyone talks about right now. It's really interesting to see a film that, for me, in my view, is the most extreme example of total creativity of the artists involved. It's one of the most artistic projects I've seen in a long time, which is exactly the opposite of what AI is doing in a way. And it's really funny to kind of like start thinking about that, how this film, in my view, in my humble opinion, is not really something that would have probably been created that way. And it can only be really created because of all of these hundreds of very talented artists that actually worked on this project. So it's I'm now looking at the film with this lens, because obviously the film came out in 2018, but now with all this conversation about AI and about automation and about how concept arts are out of business and how art in general is out of business because of AI, it's really interesting to see these kind of projects actually almost fighting back, because I look at the film that is on the cinema right now, the second one, Into the Spider-Verse, and it looks even better than the first one. So it's almost like the artistic community is looking at everything that is happening with AI and they like up the ante and making it even more difficult to reach in terms of an artistic endeavor. So this isn't a side note, but I just find it fascinating to see how this film is kind of like breaking all the boundaries and making an artistic vision on a time that we are kind of like, the general public is kind of like almost losing interest on artistic visions. But then the film is so successful. So it's funny to see that things never really change if we start thinking about it. It's but never mind. I just wanted to kind of do that side note. It's fine.
No, I think I agree with you, and I think it's be curious if Spider-Verse Into the Spider-Verse had come out after so much of the generative art
Yeah.
things have been available, and and whether any of the concept artists had used any of those tools to do it. But you're right. The absolute artistic creativity is so evident, and your book that you have, it's so fun to sort of line up concept
With the frames,
shots with final frames.
Yeah.
And that's also something, and you already mentioned it, but it was also like you would buy an art of any other animated film book, and you would be like, wow, I wish they made this film.
But it happens all the time, doesn't it? It happens all the time.
And I'm trying not to be too critical, because I think often those sketches or color keys or concept images, they are to inspire a mood
Yeah.
for a scene or a frame. They're not intended to be what it looks like.
No, but they are the absolute maximum expression of art of one person. It's the same thing when we do commercials or cinematics, or when we do work on visual effects companies, we do what we call the paint over, where we have some simple CG and then a very talented concept artist or a matte painter paints over and comes up with like some decisions in terms of lighting, in terms of rim lights, in terms of things. And that is a really creative moment, because that's a moment on a production where we're not thinking about the budget, we're not thinking about the pipeline, we're not thinking about, oh, can we do this, can we not do this? Doesn't matter. It's just one person with a brush, and he's like painting in Photoshop, and he's just coming up with things, and they are quite inexpensive because he's just coming up with brushes, and he's not concerned of how it's going to move, like he's just painting the strokes, and like, okay, they'll figure it out later on. And this is the fascinating thing about this film, which I guess is a segue to maybe what we can talk about next, which is the painting on top. But I think the interesting part here is that they've managed to transfer that world of concept art and paint over into CG by doing a very clever pipeline of doing CG and then painting on top and then going back to CG again. And I thought that was probably some of the most creative uses of a CG pipeline that I've seen in a long time, which really gave an outstanding result, especially the paint overs and the lines that you see on top when they are working, which makes the film much more interesting and much more organic as well, because it becomes less CG and becomes less automated. It just becomes more art. Yeah, it's like you said, that's why it looks like the book, because it's drawn on top like if it was a book. That's the fascinating part of it.
Absolutely. And what Hugo is talking about there is more like ink lines and outlines.
Yeah.
And just before we talk about that, I remember I talked to the visual effects supervisor at Sony Pictures Imageworks, the VFX suit for the film, Danny Dimian. And, one of the scary things, but also I think it really motivated a lot of artists there, was that Imageworks had a pipeline for doing CG animated films, and it's something they totally used here. They build in normal CG tools, they animate in Maya, they do effects and procedural stuff in Houdini, they use Katana, and they have their own version of Arnold for rendering. Well, on this film, Danny told me they needed to break that pipeline all the time for specific shots, for specific sequences. And one of the things they quickly realized they needed to do to reflect comic books, but also give the characters a new kind of emotion, was add ink lines, especially to faces. You'll see ink lines added absolutely to cars and buildings and things. Not as much in this first film, I reckon more in the second film.
Yeah.
But these ink lines were things that needed to go literally on Miles's face, like for nose bridges and around the eyes and all that kind of thing. Now, that's a lot of work because it's a 3D animated film where the 3D doesn't include the ink lines. And so do you just get an artist for every single character shot to paint in individual inclines, remembering that they're kind of 2D. So if a character moves to the right or the left, do you then have to paint the incline for each movement? So ImageWorks built a few tools where inclines could follow the contours of CG faces and CG objects, but also so that artists could draw them independently and make a point about them. Hugo, there was also some AI tools developed, machine learning tools, so that it kind of did it automatically. I actually think a lot of it just happened very, very manually, but which is probably the right way, to do this.
Yeah, I mean that is the fascinating part of this, because they used both. That's the thing, because yes, in they even talk about that on the audio commentary, where sometimes imagine, especially when there's like these still frames of a pow or a boom or even some lines behind Spider-Man. They mentioned that sometimes they just would go in one frame and paint something manually, because it's just like a really cool frame that is going to be on the middle of an action sequence. That's it. Easier and faster to paint. But when there's a large dialogue sequence, that's a more tricky thing. Like you said, it would take forever for them to paint all of that. So yes, they did a very advanced pipeline in Houdini to actually draw it's really funny, because they draw the lines inside of Houdini, and then they can rig them in the CG character as if it was a piece of CG, like a rig.
Which is important, because, as we say, the faces are moving. But also, this film was released in stereo.
Yeah, exactly.
So they had to sort of, someone will tell me, a stereographer will tell me that's not important, because you can make anything stereo. You can deal with it with roto, you can deal with it with shapes, different shapes. But those inclines in stereo, if they only looked 2D, would probably have looked off.
Exactly. No, absolutely they would. Absolutely they would. And so yeah, and as you said, the machine learning, yes, it's also here. They've used machine learning to kind of help the process in a way, because there are some really long dialogue sequences on this film, especially when Miles Morales is inside the police car with his father, and every time he's like interacting with the family, there's really long sequences where we don't have a mask, so he's there, he's like, his face is there. Even more on the second film, there's even more dialogue. So anything that can help, and in this way, this kind of thing is really good for machine learning, because you can basically make the machine learn when it rotates to the side. The line go that way. This is one of the biggest issues we've had before in the past, where they try to have outlines that are part of a shader. It never really looks quite right, because the lines kind of break, and then the lines go to the wrong place, and so it makes perfect sense to use prediction with machine learning, because you have to train the system by using multiple sequences. So now it's very inspired work, and it kind of like also, I mean, if you look at these pieces of footage, it also like helps the public to kind of tag along with this, because it gives you that sense, oh my God, they draw all of this, it's all hand drawn. There's this romantic side of it, that they did all these drawings, and you see all these pieces of footage of them painting with the Wacom tablets, and in a way that happened, but it didn't. So it's a bit like, it helps to sell the story from a behind the scene point of view, which, by the way, is very rare that we have behind the scenes where we see software. It's very rare. And on this time, we actually see software. We actually see them actually playing with the applications in these behind the scenes. But the result is outstanding. I mean, what can we say? It's a lot of hard work. It takes forever. It took forever. But it really paid off, because it gave you a complete, perfect hand-drawing feeling of a comic book. Like the still that I just have stopped now, when you're looking at it, these are some of the stills that the directors were talking on the commentary, that they went in and paint and did some stuff in on the side. These kind of frames are very incredibly difficult to do in 3D. You can't really do something like this in 3D. You have to go and paint it. You have to go do it a bit manually. I think that manual labor on this film really shines, and it really makes the film look even better. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yes, and for Western American audiences, it was something we hadn't really seen before.
No.
Similarly, something that hadn't really been done in the same way before was a mix, I think, Hugo, of changing animation frame rates
Yeah.
between ones, twos, threes, probably even fours, and also not having motion blur.
Yeah.
That you know gave it that stepped look that kind of looks like, again, a comic book still frame,
Yeah.
but also, just gave it a different handcrafted look and feel.
Yeah.
And I think that is probably something that animators must have just loved getting their hands dirty on,
Absolutely.
because they'd kind of got used to only doing fluid motion, very gestural kind of motion, both in stop motion and CG animation. So I think I loved the no motion blur, although sometimes they did have a way of putting motion blur in. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also the changeable variable frame rates. The challenge is that changing those frame rates can have effects down the line for CFX and Houdini simulations, explosions, smoke and whatnot. So ImageWorks did have to deal with that, which was a bit of a challenge. But what did you think of the stepped animation style in the film, Hugo?
Yeah, this is something that not a lot of people kind of think about, because we are so used to just seeing CG, and this is really tricky because, of course, this is all CG. It's all simulated. Usually, normally, is rendered at 24 frames per second. But then on the other side, regular animation, if you look at older animation, like either Ghibli's animation or either, French animation with Asterix or any of those kind of older animations from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's actually 12 frames per second, not 24. So this posed a huge problem because you have cloth and you have tissues and you have explosions and you have particles, you have all sorts of things that normally should be simulated on higher frame rates. And in fact, when we simulate something in CG, we even tend to simulate it with more frames than what we're going to render them so that the simulation is smoother. In this way, they had to simulate it, but then actually cut it back to its animations of 2 so that it would feel like 12 frames per second. So this was incredibly hard. And also, the other problem as well, when you start playing around with the 12 frames per second, it becomes jittery. It could become problematic. It could, especially when there's pans or when someone is moving really fast. There could be all sorts of problems. And in fact, on behind the scenes, they even have these kind of really nice examples of how problematic it was to have the animation on 2s, but then the cloth not on 2s. And then you would have these kind of stuttery effects all over the place. So it's really fascinating. This, together with the motion blur, like you mentioned, the motion blur is also really incredibly smart because, I guess it's smart in two ways, because in one way, it's a great way to make it look like a comic book, but the second way as well is not rendering motion blur means that they will, of course, be able to render much faster, because one of the biggest problems with rendering is motion blur. Motion blur takes forever to render. So at least by cutting the motion blur out, it made it much faster for them to render. Not that they did that in purpose. I'm not saying that they did. I meant it actually helped probably for them to experiment more, because it allowed them to render more and more and more versions, because it's so much faster without having to deal with motion blur and depth of field, because both these things were kind of skipped,
I think that's right. ImageWorks, having had experience doing actual Spider-Man films with their Arnold renderer, taking hours a frame and whatnot, that wasn't necessarily such a big problem here. Just on the motion blur thing, I mean, there's often no motion blur, and sometimes there is, but to introduce fake motion blur, that especially as you say when the camera pans, because that can be stuttery without motion blur, they actually, I think, did some things in comp. Where they would add in streaks or use some of those half-tone dots, to sort of pretend that there was motion blur there. So that as an audience member, you're like, oh, this is what it's meant to be doing. It's meant to be a bit blurry. It's just a different kind of motion blur than what, a live action film
Yeah.
would be. And, some of the motion blur came from classic animation techniques like streaks or smear frames,
Or several
and
limbs, like
yeah.
doing around, like we see in comic books, and also on old Hanna-Barbera animations and old
Oh, totally.
animations. Yeah.
And I should say that Imageworks had kind of, if you look at the history of their animated films, they'd kind of done some pretty cool things with more stylized look and feels. Things like Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs or even the Hotel Transylvania films.
Yeah.
They do have a lot of smear frames
Yeah.
and models breaking and stuff like that. But this just took it, as I say, to like 11.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
yeah, I think the classic feel of Into the Spider-Verse is almost solely from the lack of motion blur and animation on different variable frame rates.
Yeah.
It makes it feel like it was the 1950s, 60s Spider-Man animated films.
Absolutely.
Which is really cool.
Absolutely. And it gave it also a very organic feeling because it looks like it's a painting, or it looks like it's almost like a smear with a brush, which in a lot of situations, sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't, sometimes it was built on the CG. Like the multiple limbs, for example, it was built as a rig in CG, but for example, the smearing is actually built in compositing. So the same goes for depth of field as well. Depth of field is done in a very smart way in this film, which is kind of like done in this kind of like what's the name that I called, the aberration separation of the three colors of print. When they have like this wrong print effect that sometimes you have because these comic books are printed into the hundreds of thousands of copies, so of course they would sometimes misprint for a few millimeters. And using that almost like a fake stereoscopic feeling was really smart because it kind of gave you the illusion of depth of field, but it's not depth of field at all. It kind of reminds you of these comic books, but it also gives you an idea that there's a blur, but it's like your eyes are looking at it and thinking it's a blur, but it's not a blur. It's really smart. I felt the implementation of depth of field, and it's like you said, it really makes the look of this film, and this film really looks like nothing else we've seen before because of that. I think those two things, and again, very creative uses of, especially Nuke in this situation. We already mentioned Houdini on the rigs and on the splines. In this situation, for the depth of field and for the stylization of the motion blur, they did. I saw this amazing presentation at FMX where they did these amazing gizmos and scripts and plugins inside of Nuke where they could dial in certain streaks and they could dial in the actual separation of the fields of the red, green, and blue colors so that it would look more blurred or less blurred. And this was really smart. It's a really great way of using the stereoscopic tools to their advantage to try to separate the three colors using compositing, the same way that they also used it to do this kind of cel-shaded look by dialing it in and out depending on the frames, and also the dots as well, and the half tone. A lot of this kind of was driven by compositing with a really robust Nuke compositing pipeline, which is really interesting use of Nuke for something like this, because I also never really saw Nuke being used like this. This is something very fresh.
Which I'm guessing was a really, really good way of being able to have a lot of control.
Yeah.
At the end of the process, but by the same token, also a really challenging way of doing the film, because you had to wait until compositing to get the look you're after.
Yeah.
Which any visual effects artist is going, yeah, well, that's what you do in compositing. But we were just so used to basically doing renders in CG animated films that are basically the final frame.
Yeah.
Right? There is totally a lot of compositing that goes on in all these big animated films. Don't let anyone tell you anything different.
Yeah.
But I think...
Well, the general public has a wrong idea on that sense. They think it's all... And this, not to blame them, but I kind of feel that this in part is a bit because of Pixar's past of how they did films, and they kind of sell this idea that the frames come out of the farm as they are. They sell it a little bit like that on the marketings and also on the behind the scenes, which is a bit further from the truth. They do a lot of compositing. All these studios do a lot of compositing. Some studios do more compositing than others, like historically, for example, Blue Sky used to do a lot of compositing on their films, and then on the other spectrum, Pixar would do less compositing than Blue Sky. So depending on the studio, they have different pipelines in that sense. But Sony has always had a huge compositing pipeline. They've always done that in the past. And so taking advantage of that makes perfect sense, because some of this stuff would be incredibly tricky to do in 3D. I mean, it would take ages. It also would take a huge amount of R&D to develop. And, Nuke's ability to do fast, quick, and dirty stuff in compositing actually fits the style of the film. It fits the film. This kind of quick and dirty image look, it's perfect for what they're trying to achieve,
Absolutely. Just in terms of more technology that was going on at ImageWorks to do this stuff, Hugo, one thing I loved so much was again, fitting into the 2D stylization of the film, things like explosions were absolutely done using Houdini, but with, beginning, like hand-drawn parts of it as the beginnings of the explosions, and then enhanced with, Houdini workflows to enable so many of them to happen, and also to give them that 3D look. There's the final fight sequence in the film in the Collider, which I just think has... and again, it's kind of what has been appearing in a lot of anime and manga films and shows, which are these 2D looking explosions, which are on the screen now. I just think I almost love that the most, and I was like, I could watch a whole series just with those sorts of explosions. But I happened to write an article for Side Effects when the film came out that explores a bit of that 2D-ness, which people will think, oh, they drew them and, then added them into the frame. Well, they totally did, but they're still Houdini explosions. Sprite-like, I suppose you would describe them, right?
Yeah, it's like this kind of... I guess anyone that is listening that is from the games industry will know that this is how we used to do explosions all the time in games. Yeah. We don't anymore. Games are now more sophisticated and actually have proper simulated in Houdini pipeline particle systems inside of games themselves. But until like 5 years ago, or maybe even 7 years ago, games explosions were done like this. Were done with cards and sprites, pretending to have depth by using like multiple of them in Z space. And this is a really smart... Again, it really perfectly fits the look of the film, because it transports you to this look of the comic books, but it also gives you three-dimensionality, both for the 3D of the film, because the film, of course, was released in stereoscopic, but also not just for the 3D, but for the camera moves, because the film is quite dynamic. It has a lot of camera moves. And so these sprites couldn't just be regular sprites. You would have to have sprites facing camera and in certain depth aspects so that they would actually look like they're actually volumetric. And that's a really smart use of Houdini, really, if you think about it. Like the methodology of doing this is really remarkable, and nothing new. It's like you said, none of this stuff is new. The funny thing with this is that they basically picked up 5, 7, 10 things and glue them together. That's what they're doing here. And it's remarkable because, they're grabbing, okay, let's get the... I'm just paraphrasing. Let's get the explosions from manga. Let's get this cool particle system in 3D from like the Spider-Man. Let's get the pan look, the dot look from the magazine. Let's get the halftone lighting from this magazine. Oh, let's get the bubbles from Kirby, from Curb. Like let's just merge all these things together. It's almost like an impossible collage. But it works. Like for some reason, they managed to get it to work, which is remarkable. Like how did they manage to marry and merge all these things together? Again in compositing, of course, that's how you merge all these things together. but it's hats to the team because they did a remarkable job on that sense, you know.
Yeah. So definitely shout out to the 2D and 3D effects artists for those explosions in particular, and as you say, incorporating Kirby dots and
Yeah.
other comic book shapes, and everything
It's like
about the comic book came
it's
in.
like a catalog, isn't it? It's like a
Yeah.
show reel of everything we've seen since we were young men, you know, like reading these comic books when we were like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. We saw all these things on these comic books, and now we reach the phase where they've managed to transport them to the screen, which is really fascinating. And I can't wait to see more films to take advantage of something like this. I feel like the best is yet to come, really, to be honest, because after seeing the second one, I thought this was it, and then I saw the second one. There's even more advanced looks, even more advanced pipelines that are going on there. It's like even more complex, which I really thought it was going to be impossible to do. But yeah,
somehow the second film is even more painterly.
Yeah.
Yet,
Yeah.
of course, it's a 3D animated film.
Yeah.
In the same way. And we will talk about it, but the painterly aspect of it, not just because Gwen's world is literally a watercolor world, but because all of the backgrounds, in other places like the India Spider-Man, Mumbattan, and elsewhere, just has that painterly feel. I feel like they got there on the first film for many shots, but it actually is more comic book inspired. The first film,
even more.
This second film is more painterly inspired. I think in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a different type of comic book. That's the thing. Probably, if you start thinking about the first film, is almost like more close to the 80s typical comic book of Batman and Superman and Spider-Man, and now we're kind of moving on to the late 90s 2000s type of graphic novels. It's almost like that. And one quick shout out that I would love to say, this was not just on the film itself, the look of the film, because I know we're just talking about the look, but the sound design and the musicscape is also done in a very similar way. It's very fascinating to see. There's a few articles about that in the internet that people can go and check, but the music was orchestrated by he's the music composer for both films, Daniel Pemberton, I think that's how you pronounce his name. And the fascinating about it is that he actually used the same type of collage methodology on sound that they did on the image, by using full 80-piece orchestras on the film, but mixed with percussions and electronic sounds, and sometimes percussions being done with paper and newspapers and drums and unbalanced instruments, things that were disaligned and detuned. He used a lot of detuned instruments to make it look weird and broken. And even the most funny example of all of this is that he recorded this 80-piece orchestra of music on vinyl, and then he scratched the vinyl to break the music apart. And I found the soundtrack is really haunting, especially the Prowler. The Prowler's music is absolutely mind-blowing, and it comes from this amazing experimentation sound that Daniel is doing, and again, very similar to the methodology that they are doing on the image as well, on the image side. I thought the soundscapes were really good. On the second film, they're also very good. But the props to the Prowler's soundtrack. Whenever he's on screen, is haunting. It's scary. That bass is really scary, and it really works really well with the images.
Yeah. Also, I think that use of the Sunflower song, which I think is by Post Malone, is one of the best character introduction type songs that's been used in an animated film recently. Just so
Absolutely.
Cool. I think I listened to that 10 billion times when the film came out.
Absolutely. No, I mean, we there's so much to talk about on this film, but we can't, of course, cover everything. But there's of course another side of this which we are not even going to touch, which is like the acting and also the characters. I mean, the Nicolas Cage's character is amazing. He's like really giving the entire cage on him. Also, of course, Spider-Ham, as you said, Penny Parker is also really funny. And of course, one of my favorites is Peter B. Parker. He's really hilarious. He's really funny.
And touching, isn't it? That's
super touching.
I mean, that is what I meant right at the front when I said, forget the stylized look and feel. There's an emotion to this film.
Yeah.
And actually, oh my God, in the second film, the same kind of thing comes out even more.
Yeah.
And it's actually why this film works.
Yeah.
And you it's very clever to use the multiverse.
Yeah.
To kind of make you stop and think about what it's like to be Spider-Man.
I know. It's so touching. On this, especially on the first one, it happened a few times, but on this, especially with the Prowler scenes, because I thought they were so powerful, especially when we then discover. Spoiler alert, I hope everyone has seen the film already. Otherwise, skip a couple of seconds when they discover that it's his uncle. But on the second film, I'm not going to spoil anything, but on the second film, I must say, I didn't cry on the second film, but there was a few moments, especially on the very beginning with Gwen and also with Peter B. Parker. There was a few moments that you kind of like get misty eyes and you get a bit like, when you have your stomach goes a bit up or something. There's a few moments on the second film that happened to me, and I'm sure it happened to other people as well. I feel, you're saying as well that it happened to you as well. I think the second film is even more touching than the first one. There's something that I really like about the second one, which the first one, I felt the first one had a few too many fights, and I wish that it was a bit less fighting and more character development. That's why it was like saying that I wish those other shots were in and maybe some few fights could go out. I love the fact that the second one almost has no fights, and I love that the second one is much more the story-driven, the characters, and there's only a couple of really amazing sequences of fights and chases, but it's a lot more contained. And that's really smart because it develops a much more emotional journey on the second film that the first one has, but not as much on the second one. I love, I think it's one of those examples that the second one's better than the first one, like The Godfather 2. It's like, it is definitely one of those examples where the sequel is better than the first one.
Yeah. Well, Hugo, we better save our discussion for a separate episode.
Of course.
It's been really fun revisiting this film from 2018, and if you haven't seen it, everyone go out and watch it, and then of course go and watch the sequel.
Like me, I only watched it in 2023. I'm sure gonna have some hate comments about that. But
okay, I want lots of hate mail about this film to Hugo, and I want double the hate mail about The Revenant to Hugo as well. Okay, thank you, thanks everybody. All right, Hugo, let's finish up. And again, thank you to our sponsors, our subscribers, our Patreon supporters. We really appreciate it. Hugo, it's been so much fun chatting about Spider-Verse.
It was great. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I'll see you later. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.